Today, this conflict left the Middle East, not metaphorically, not as a diplomatic warning, physically. A United States submarine fired a torpedo in the Indian Ocean. An Iranian ballistic missile crossed Iraqi airspace, then Syrian airspace, then approached the border of a NATO member state. And the global insurance architecture for maritime energy trade was restructured by a presidential announcement in a single social media post. 3 developments, 3 different oceans and continents. One day. Stay with this. Because what happened today does not fit inside any of the frameworks that analysts have been using to describe this conflict since it began 5 days ago. The standard model assumed a regional confrontation, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, Israel, and the immediate neighborhood. That model is now operationally obsolete. Before we explain what each of these developments actually signals, and we will go through each one precisely, there's a question that reframes everything. When a conflict expands this fast, this far, in this many directions simultaneously, is it still being strategically directed? Or has it entered a phase where the escalation ladder is running on its own momentum? Hold that question. We will come back to it. The first development broke early Wednesday morning, local time, off the southern coast of Sri Lanka. The Iranian frigate Iris Dana, a Mauj-class warship carrying approximately 180 crew members armed with surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, and torpedoes, sent a distress signal into the Sri Lankan Coast Guard network at approximately 6 in the morning. Sri Lankan naval vessels and aircraft responded immediately. When they reached the coordinates, there was no ship. There was an oil slick. United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the incident at a Pentagon briefing later that day. An American submarine had fired a torpedo. The Iris Dana sank in international waters, approximately 40 nautical miles off the port city of Galle. Sri Lankan authorities rescued 32 sailors and recovered multiple bodies. More than 100 crew members remained unaccounted for. Hegseth's description of the strike was precise. He called it, and this framing is analytically important, quiet death. He noted it was the first time a United States submarine had sunk an enemy vessel by torpedo since the Second World War. That is not a casual historical reference. That is a deliberate institutional signal about the scope of what the United States has authorized in this operational phase. But here is what that location tells us that the Pentagon briefing did not say directly. The Iris Dana was not in the Persian Gulf. It was not in the Arabian Sea. It was in the Indian Ocean, southeast of Sri Lanka, in waters that sit at the intersection of the primary maritime trade corridors connecting the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. This is where the strategic picture changes. Iran has maintained a small but symbolically significant naval presence in the Indian Ocean for several years. The Iris Dana had participated in a joint naval exercise with Russian and Chinese vessels in the Bay of Bengal as recently as February 18th to 25th of this year, 10 days before it was sunk. The signal being sent by this strike is not primarily tactical. Sinking one frigate does not materially degrade Iranian naval capability. The signal is geographic. It establishes that United States submarine operations in this conflict are not bounded by the Persian Gulf. They extend to any ocean where Iranian naval assets operate. That has direct implications for how Iran, China, and Russia calculate their own naval positioning going forward. Now, set the Indian Ocean aside for a moment, because the second development carries a different category of risk entirely. An Iranian ballistic missile was fired and tracked as it traveled across Iraqi airspace, then Syrian airspace, then approached the border of Turkey. NATO air and missile defense systems deployed in the eastern Mediterranean intercepted and destroyed the missile before it entered Turkish airspace. Debris from the interceptor, confirmed by the Turkish Defense Ministry to belong to the defense system, not the incoming missile, landed in the dirty old district of Hatay province. No casualties, no injuries. The Turkish Defense Ministry issued a formal statement. It confirmed the incident. It confirmed NATO assets conducted the intercept. And it issued a direct warning to all parties to refrain from actions that would lead to further escalation. That is not the language of a government that feels insulated from this conflict. That is the language of a NATO member that just watched a foreign ballistic missile track across 2 countries toward its own territory. This is a point that rarely gets enough attention. Turkey sits in an extraordinary structural position in this crisis. It is a NATO member with Article 5 mutual defense commitments. It shares a border with both Syria and Iraq, the airspace the missile crossed. It hosts Incirlik Air Base, where more than 1,000 United States military personnel are stationed. And it has maintained active diplomatic channels with Tehran throughout the entire operational period, urging restraint from all sides. United States Defense Secretary Hegseth addressed the Article 5 question directly. He stated Washington saw no sense that this incident would trigger the Collective Defense Clause. Legally and procedurally, he is correct. Article 5 activation requires a deliberate armed attack against a member state. Turkey has not characterized this as deliberate targeting of its territory, but the strategic reality is distinct from the legal framework. What most coverage misses entirely is this. Iran just fired a ballistic missile that required NATO air defense assets to activate in defense of a member state as airspace. That happened, regardless of intent, regardless of trajectory ambiguity. The institutional fact is now on the record. NATO engaged Iranian ordnance over the eastern Mediterranean. That is a threshold that was not crossed before today. The deeper constraint lies in what this does to Turkey's positioning. Ankara has been the only major regional power maintaining simultaneous diplomatic contact with Washington, with Tehran, and with European capitals throughout this conflict. That positioning has value for all sides. The moment Turkey's territory becomes a transit corridor for Iranian ballistic trajectories, that positioning becomes harder to maintain domestically. The Turkish public is watching. The Turkish parliament is watching. And that matters directly for the third development of the day, which received the least coverage and carries perhaps the most lasting structural consequence. President Trump posted on social media that the United States government would provide shipping companies with insurance coverage for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf, specifically for energy shipments. He also stated that, if necessary, the United States Navy would begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Read that twice. The United States government is now in the maritime insurance business. For tankers, in an active conflict zone. Here's the data point that will surprise most people following this story. The global maritime insurance market operates on actuarial models built over decades of stable assumptions about transit corridor risk. When a government steps in and offers sovereign-backed insurance for a specific corridor in a conflict zone, it does two things simultaneously. It acknowledges that the private market has effectively withdrawn from that risk, and it places the United States Treasury in a direct financial exposure position tied to the physical security of the Strait of Hormuz. If a tanker under that program is struck by any means, the United States government absorbs the claim, which means every tanker transiting the strait under that program is functionally an extension of American sovereign financial commitment. Striking one becomes striking American financial infrastructure. Iran built its deterrence model around the idea that threatening the strait would impose costs on the global economy and thereby on American interests indirectly. That announcement just made that relationship direct. Now, the actor calculus that today forces into the open. For the United States, the submarine strike and the insurance announcement represent two sides of the same strategic logic, demonstrate that American power projection has no geographic boundary in this conflict, while simultaneously offering a commercial framework that makes continued energy flow economically rational for shipping companies. The internal tension is that both commitments carry open-ended fiscal and operational costs that have not been publicly quantified. For Iran, today's signals are structurally contradictory. The ballistic missile toward Turkey was fired on the same day that senior Iranian officials publicly stated Iran will not negotiate with the United States and can continue this conflict indefinitely. Those two data points together suggest a command environment under extreme stress, not a command environment executing a coherent strategic plan. For Turkey, the path forward narrows with every passing day. Its mediation value depends on not being a direct participant. Today's incident pushes it closer to participant status, whether it chooses that role or not. For China and Russia, the Indian Ocean dimension activates a different set of concerns. Both nations participated in naval exercises with Iran in those waters within the past 2 weeks. The sinking of the Iris Dana in those same waters sends a direct message about the risks of operating alongside Iranian naval assets in any theater during this operational period. For Europe, the NATO intercept over Turkey adds institutional pressure on an alliance whose consensus is already visibly strained. 7 NATO members have formally criticized the operation. Now NATO air defense systems are actively engaging Iranian ordnance. The gap between those two positions is not sustainable indefinitely. 3 scenarios frame the trajectory from here. In the low probability scenario, the geographic expansion of today's incidents generates sufficient alarm to accelerate a diplomatic framework. The Turkish incident specifically could catalyze NATO-level pressure on Washington to define clearer operational boundaries. The conditions exist. The political momentum does not yet. The medium probability scenario, the most likely equilibrium, is that today's developments are absorbed as operational facts without triggering formal escalation thresholds. The tanker escort program begins, submarine operations continue in expanded theaters. Turkey manages the missile incident through diplomatic channels. The conflict continues at high intensity within a new, larger geographic envelope. The economic costs accumulate. The pressure builds slowly rather than sharply. In the high probability scenario, if current trends persist, the geographic expansion becomes self-reinforcing. Each new theater opens pressure points that generate responses that open further theaters. The insurance program creates new categories of potential escalation. The Indian Ocean precedent invites further positioning by all naval powers with assets in the region. Today, this conflict left the Middle East. What that means for the next phase depends entirely on a question that no government involved has publicly answered. Is there a geographic boundary to this operation? Is there a point on the map where escalation stops by design rather than by exhaustion? Because if that boundary exists, it has not been communicated. And if it has not been communicated, the actors who need to respect it have no way of knowing where it is. That is not a military problem. That is a strategic architecture problem. And it is the question that will define whether the next 5 days look like the last 5, or like something that does not yet have a name.